You're listening to Cultureful. I'm your host, Jess Lynn. I had an unexpected hiatus this year, and I'm very happy to be back. In 2025, I will be creating more content more regularly. Here is a head start on that for you to enjoy during the end of the year holidays. I interviewed Tonisha, a Black American woman veteran of the Air Force. Our plan was to explore her service and how that led to her love of food and travel. Organically, we ended up following the flow of conversation to genealogy, family stories, her time in the Air Force, and much more. It was a rich, deep dive conversation. Here's the first of 2 parts. The second part will drop in a few days. I hope you enjoy, and I'm wishing you and yours happy holidays. Hi, Tonisha. How are you today?
Good. Hello, Jess. I'm well, to say the least, I guess.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you. I know. Nice to see you too. I know. It's been, what, you guys left in August?
We moved, in August.
Yeah.
And for the listener, my husband and I moved from Sacramento to Atlanta. So I am talking to Tonisha from Atlanta, and you are in Sacramento, right?
Yes. I am in Sacramento.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to hear more about your military experience and reflections today, and also, how they kind of inform your relationship with food and travel. We kind of talked about it a little bit. So I'm really grateful you're on today to have this conversation and to share, some of these thoughts and experiences. But yeah, can you start by introducing your pronouns, your age, and your ethnic identity?
Yes. She, her. I'm 42 as of September, which is always bizarre. I don't feel like I've been around that long, but apparently I have.
And you definitely don't look 42.
Oh,
So.
thank you. Thank you. I know I get that a lot. Like I've literally had someone made me show them my ID to prove that I was. This is like a couple of years ago. I think I was like 38, and they're like, "You're lying." And I was like, "Why would I age myself?" And it was weird. And they're like, "I believe you." So I was like, "Okay." And they're like, "Oh my god!" And I'm like, like, because that's always like an interesting like conversation, I guess, with people. And they're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Good genes and water, I guess." Like, so let me see, 42.
And your ethnic and cultural identities.
Oh, yes. So I call myself a Black American. I have my own particular like nuances with the term African American, which technically is incorrect for those of us who have been, like, our families have been in this country for umpteen years, right? So I consider myself a Black American. My family is Creole, which is a mix of French and like African, and we have recently found out we have Irish and Jewish. I think on Jewish on my grandfather's side.
Interesting.
So yeah, very interesting. His backstory is crazy. Also, I think that's it. And then native, there's some native in there as well.
Which parts did you just find out about?
The more of the Jewish and the Irish. So I've always grown up knowing that like, oh, Creole and Native American or and so it's like, okay, cool, right? In which Creole is a mix of a few cultures. And then recently, like with everyone doing their genealogy, like I haven't done mine, but I've had like my aunt, my sister, different people did theirs. And so like this thing, and I'm like, oh, and like this side of the family, I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And then looking into the history of like the area of Louisiana and prior to the Louisiana Purchase with all that, what most people don't realize, I guess the word Creole originally meant just the free people of color. And in that area, there was
Mm.
natives, French, Irish, which people don't speak about being there. So once that came about, that we had Irishness, I was like, oh, I guess that makes sense. Having done research and knowing a little more of the back history of that area. The Irish is from my mom's mom, and then the Jewish is from my mom's dad, so my grandfather.
Was it your maternal grandfather that had the very interesting story?
Yes, yes.
So now I must know. Like, this is the most fascinating intro ever, but let's get sidetracked.
Okay, okay, okay. Let's do it. So I'll try to be brief.
No, don't be brave. Tell me the story.
So he was the youngest of, I think it's like 6 kids,
Uh-huh.
and something happened. His mom ended up going into the hospital, and to my understanding, it was she was put under like mental watch or whatever, and so
Mm.
his father had to take the kid. You know, they were together, but the father had to take charge of the kids and stuff. And my grandfather apparently was considered the black sheep of the family as far as like skin tone and things. And this is where you look back and where colorism has like affected people's lives in ways that people don't understand. So it's like, but he was darker skin tone. Not that he was dark. He's darker than me, but he was just like a brown tone. I don't just a brown tone. But because he was darker than everyone else, his dad didn't want him. So his dad gave him up for adoption.
Oh my gosh.
So his dad didn't want him, so he put him up for adoption. So he got adopted. And my whole life, I grew up knowing that he was adopted by a white family, is what he knew. So it's like a white family that adopted him and raised him, and all this stuff. Come to find out, fast forward to like current years, current times, with genealogy and all the research and things. To my understanding, the family that adopted him was his mom's actual aunt. So my grandfather's mom was half Jewish, and so the family that adopted him, that he would just say like, "Oh, this really nice white family adopted him," turned out to be that it was his mom's aunt. So his whole life, he just thought it was some
Whoa.
nice people that adopted him, um, and he actually really was a family. But he never knew that. He passed away when I was in 4th grade, so that's not something he was privy to. It's crazy because you think about the time around when he was born, right? So this would have been like late 1920s, probably late 1920s. Because say my grandma was born in 33. She's 91. I think she's 33. And my grandfather
Do
was
you
a
know
few
where this
years.
was?
He's from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yeah. So it would have been like mid to late 20s and in East Coast. And so I was like, oh, it makes sense that they didn't tell him, probably for safe reasons. Like a white couple adopting a little black kid. So it just probably looked like they were just more being a very generous or whatever.
So he was adopted by his Jewish great aunt and her husband,
Mm-hmm.
and they were white, and he didn't know he was related to them, and he didn't know he was mixed race.
To my understanding, he didn't know. And yeah, his mom's aunt from the Jewish side, so and they were white, adopted him. So his mom was half, so he would have been a quarter. And to my understanding, I don't think he knew. He never spoke of it. And when I was younger, he was like, when I was in, like, he lived with me and my mom with us. Gosh, I think like 3rd to 4th grade or so. And so he was like my best friend when I was little. Like my best friend was my grandfather when I was
Ah.
little. And so he would tell me stories and teach me stuff and different things like that. So I don't remember him mentioning it. Yeah.
Now I must know. What was he like? What are some of your favorite memories with him?
To be honest, the one thing I remember, he taught me how to cook. This is funny, but he taught me how to cook fancy top ramen, as I would call it when I was little. Um, Cause like when I always loved like cup of noodles and stuff like that, and so I'd come home, and I remember the first time he was like, "You can't eat it like that," and I'm like, "What?" And so he like whipped up he like boiled the egg, and I think he shredded cabbage, and he just, it was fancy, for like a fourth grader. You're like, oh, this is fancy, right? And so now
This is
fast forward,
gourmet.
yeah, fast forward, be like, oh, that's actually how you're supposed to eat ramen, right? So, um, but when I was, little, I was like, oh, mom, grandma taught me to cook fancy top ramen, whatever. So, that was like my first intro into, like, I guess, real ramen, but not knowing it was like real ramen. And so, a quick insert, because we're going to talk about how I got into the military. My grandfather was actually former military, so he was retired military, and so that's what actually kind of encouraged me to go. So I think growing up, having him as like my best friend for, like, he lived with us for a year or so, and like I said, grow up hearing all the stories he would tell me and different things. And then we would take him to the base. And so, as a little kid, you're like, whoa, this is cool. And I was somewhat of a tomboy when I was younger, even though I was like put in dresses and everything else. I still was a kid that, like, I was like, I want cars. I want, the boys had the cool toys in me. And so I still played Barbies, and I like Barbies a lot,
The
but
boys did.
they did. They had way cooler toys. So
Yeah, they had the cool toys, and they had the toys where you get to build stuff, you get to move stuff, you get to, I don't know, I still get bitter about like gendered toys.
yeah, no,
That's a whole
seriously,
separate conversation where, yeah, like what is this Barbie gonna, oh man, I used to get so annoyed when I got gifted Barbies as a kid, and I just want to play with my brother's toys because they were more functional.
yeah.
But nothing against Barbies. But it was just like I was an angry little feminist personally. Okay, so what did you call this grandpa?
I just called him Grandpa. Like, no, like, fancy name. Growing up, I just had like my mom's dad.
What was grandpa's job in the military, and what were some of the stories you heard as a kid?
So my grandfather, well, he started out Army, and then he retired Air Force, and that came about because so Army, it was the Army Air Corps initially, until, I want to say, I should know this because they like breed it into you in basic, in the Air Force at least. I want to say it was 1947 that they split. He was a crew chief, so he helped work on the fighter jets and stuff like that. So when it split, of course, he went with the planes because that was to his job. So I would hear, because he was in Korea, so I want to say the telling the Korean War, and then also Vietnam. So I would hear like the stories of being over there. And, obviously, as a grown up, you're not telling the little kid like the horror stories. You're like telling them like the friends you made, or the like walking around in cool things. I don't remember anything specific at the moment.
Do you remember what was your feeling when you were hearing these stories?
I was always in awe of his stories. And I always, in my mind, I was like, whoa, what's this cool land you're talking about? Like, because it's like somewhere so far away. And I think as a kid, especially someone who read books and stuff growing up, you're like, oh, it's a whole nother land. It's a cool world. Like, and there's people that look different, and they eat different food, and wow. So I think growing up with him, now I think about it, probably started a certain intrigue for certain stuff, and hearing stories. And they're very like a little opposite of my mom's, because my mom, as a kid, right, was a military kid. So she would talk about like moving all the time and like losing friends, and
Hmm.
just hard to like make friends because you're like, oh, I don't know when I'm leaving or stuff. So to hear the contrast of like my grandfather having these like cool, crazy like stories about like friends, basically, right? I think looking at the opposite side, right? There's always the grass is greener. So he, on his side, was like, these things, you make friends and food and things. And my mom was more of like, and it makes sense because as a child, right, you only see the world a certain way. So for her is like the losing of the friends. But his stories were, I just remember always being in awe and be like, that's so cool. Or, you know,
That sounds really interesting. That was it that you were more in awe of where he got to go rather than his job? Because it sounds like a lot of it had to do with him being in these different countries rather
yeah,
than him doing his Air Force job.
yeah. Yeah, this, it's probably right. I would say you're correct. I feel, I do feel like I was in awe of like the places he got to go. I think the experiences, right? The experiences that his job allowed him to have. So yeah, his job to me was cool too. And I was, you're like, oh, but by the time I also was around, he is already retired. So we would go on base to take him to like the BX or the PX, so like the shopping and stuff. And we would, maybe go by the flight line and he'd talk about the planes. But I think if he was probably in during the time and I'd say I visited him at work and got to like go see the plane, like touch the plane, his job per se would have had a bigger impact versus the
Mm.
stories. Yeah. But the stories are always cool. I just remember almost like nightly, I feel like he would tell me something, almost like bedtime story kind
Wow.
of sometimes. And sometimes it'd be like in the daytime when I came home from school, like as we're, eating or doing something. So,
This is so okay. I think your observation of maybe this was filtered through what he was comfortable to tell a child, right?
yeah.
That's a really interesting observation because maybe you had a rosy picture because he was living with you when you were this kid, right? You weren't like a teenager. You were in elementary school. So he had to dial, his stories to something that was like accessible to you and appropriate for you. And so that's really interesting that then was like your first impressions about the military and what life could be like in the military. Yeah, and also it's interesting to me that he talked about it so often as someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with I didn't grow up around military stories, right? And I had some friends later join like ROTC or like the reserves or and then I met a friend later on who had been in the Marines, but every time it would be shocking to me because I realized that I just didn't grow up around that many military service folks. And so I would always be surprised that like someone else thought of this as an option to go and do because it just never was on my radar. And so my interaction with military stories, like it's so disproportionately movies and shows. And you just see the stuff about like veterans if they've been somewhere at the time of some conflict, maybe they've, seen horror stories like you were saying that he didn't mention to you. And that sometimes people don't want to talk about their service, but it's interesting that your grandpa was like, home and talking to you about all these positive sides of his service, even though he was involved at these different times. So that's like, it's a really, this is really helpful to like debunk some of these things I'm holding in my head. And there's no reason I should be holding those things in my head. So thanks for sharing. Like these, I'm just imagining you guys eating ramen and him telling you about some of his, travels and times abroad. And it's just this like very different picture from what I had in my mind, even though I shouldn't have had any picture in my mind.
Yeah. That's understandable. It makes sense. Of, I think from my own experience now, having experienced certain things that I realized he went through, right? Because as a kid, like he's telling me, like, oh, I've been to this place and saw this or did this or and even with the ramen, I think it was Korea that he was like, oh, I learned to do it there, here, and this is what we would do, and as he's showing me, and but then as you get older, you realize like there's certain things, of course, like adults not going to tell you. And then myself having been to war most of the times, I realized like, he's telling me like the cool things, but of course you don't want to tell a kid like the horrible things or the unfavorable experiences that you've had. It's funny because I oftentimes realize, like, I think if um, my grandfather would have been alive when I was older, because he passed away also I was in elementary school. I think if he would have been alive when I was older and I told him I wanted to go to the Air Force, I have a feeling he would have told me no. Just having
That gives me the chills.
been through it and done certain things and now realizing the parts of the stories that were left out and the parts of certain experiences, I have a feeling he would have told me don't, like, not to do it.
Wow.
Yeah, which is crazy because I have a niece on my father's side, my sister on my dad's side, and she wanted to go, and my sister was like, "Oh, she wants to talk to you." I was like, "Okay," and I was like, "I'm just letting you know, I'm gonna be honest with her because there's things that we as adults like to sugarcoat, right? Or you're like these things, but I'm like, she's in high school, so she's old enough to understand certain stuff, and um, to let her know, so that way she can make an educated decision off what she's doing and not just like the glory of things, right? And I think for me too, like having the stories and stuff from my grandfather, but also seeing the respect I think that he had in the community when I was growing up. And so even though he was retired, he used to cut hair, like he would barber. And so there's times we'd like go to the barber shop and different things, or I'd go visit him and hang out, and you walk around, like we'd walk to the store and things, and um, just a lot of respect was shown for him. And so people, they would call him Sarge. Everyone just knew and loved him, and I think as a child seeing that, I kind of connected it to, like, oh, I want to be respected, or I want to have that kind of like interaction with people. So on top of the stories, I think was a high influence of me going into the military, right? And so, and my mom, for her, it was like, oh, that's a good job, right? And also, you don't want to say favorites, but people have a parent they kind of prefer, I'll say. And for her, it was my grandfather. I think that also for her was like, oh, yeah, doing something that mimicked like the person that she admired, right? So when I was like, oh, I'm going to go to the military, she's like, oh, yeah, you should, but also, I don't think she was privy to certain conversations and experiences also. So
Right. I was saying she probably got a lot of the rated G stories too.
yeah, yep, exactly. So
As his daughter. Yeah.
yeah.
Now I'm thinking of him in my mind as Grandpa Sarge.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Well, it's funny because as once he, like, passed away and stuff, and because people called him Sarge, but oh, my grandma and my uncle, I remember when they're going through paperwork and looking for some stuff, whatever, and half his paperwork said like sergeant, and half his paperwork said like captain. And before I went in, I was like, whatever. But because those are two different ranking structures. So one is
Right.
a enlisted, and one is a commissioned officer. So I'm not sure if when the Army Air Corps split and when he went Air Force, if he switched, if he went commissioned, or even during his time in the war, because there are instances where people will get like promoted because they something heroic and things like that. So, but even in this day and age, you have people that come in enlisted and then they'll go to OTS, which is Officer Training School. Yeah, it's an intriguing thing. And he was also a POW for a little bit. I don't know the full story or the length of time. I don't know if it was Korea or Vietnam. I think that might have been in Vietnam, but I'm not 100% sure.
Wow.
So yeah.
It sounds like there was a lot that was edited out for the rated G versions of
Very,
his.
very much so. Yeah.
What was he like? What was his personality like? What did he look like? Describe a little bit. Now I'm just curious what, Grandpa Sarge was like.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, he was cool. Like, he was like the coolest person I probably knew, really, at the time. Granted, and with the goods, there's some negative nuances too. But as far as like temperament, I don't know, he was loving to me. Um, and always had a good time. Always enjoyed being around him. I want to say, I don't know how tall he was. Maybe 6 foot just under, but I also was a kid. So it's like,
Everyone seemed tall.
yeah, everyone's tall. Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know. Was he kind of like a serious type? Was he kind of lighthearted? Like,
I feel like a combination of both. Because there was like, I think if
okay,
you looked at him, he probably looked serious, but he laughed a lot. And as far as I remember, at least he laughed with me a lot and stuff. I think with the grandkids too, there's always like there's the grandpa persona, right, versus the probably dad
that's
or
true.
like or like friend persona.
Yeah.
So his hair was like salt and pepper. It was like grayish black, but then there was like salt and pepper and then like white in the front kind of. And he had all his hair. He didn't go bald. He had like not a buzz cut, so he like like tied on the sides and then a little on the top.
Okay. Yeah, it's style.
Yeah, he wore
I mean, if he's going to be a barber, then he definitely need to like advertise his work. Yeah.
yeah
Uh-huh.
he wore I think a lot of polo shirts, slacks or jeans
Okay.
type.
All
So
right, all right. It's starting to come together. My my mental sketch,
yeah,
Grandpa Sarge. That was a really fun profile. So thanks for introducing me to Grandpa Sarge. Thank you.
you're welcome.
That was nice. That was sweet.
Thanks for listening.
Of course. Let's take a quick break and then we'll be back for more. So back to you. When did you start thinking about wanting to join yourself?
Honestly, I feel like it forever. I know I was little. I don't know if it was after he passed away. I feel like it might have been after he passed away. I know it was like elementary school, at least fifth, maybe sixth grade. It's weird because I had this like I'm gonna grow up and be a famous saxophone player, but I'm also going to the military. Those are like the three things that I remember growing up saying I wanted to do. I was like, I'm gonna go to the military, and then I wanted to be a famous saxophone player, and then for some reason I wanted to be a judge. like, um, so it's like
All very different things.
things see very different, very different.
Uh-huh.
And I actually started playing saxophone in fifth grade, and for I think a year, and then that kind of phased out, and then
You also became
I
a judge for a year.
yeah no I know right. I mean kind of like in the military kind of though. I well as I got older and probably when I hit high school and I actually was like looking into it and I realized like, oh, you have to be elected. And for some reason I was like, oh yeah, no. To be honest, I think, yeah, I was turned off. But the reason I was turned off is because I think it was like the reality of the weight of the world where it's like,
Mm.
I don't look like at the time what you would say like the conventional judge looks like, right? And I was like, oh yeah, how am I
Mm.
supposed to convince these people that don't look like me to vote for me to become judge, right? So it's like, do I want to spend umpteen years going through law school, going through this, and because how long it takes. So I was like, oh, I can do all this stuff, but if I don't get elected, I'm not able to do what I prepped to do this for. So it was one of those
Mm.
where I just like, okay, scratch that, that's just fine. It's also a sentiment of kind of like the environment around us, right? So
Right. And a reminder of like the importance of representation for kids and
absolutely,
for any age. But yeah, just
yeah,
like not it is so oh man, yeah. And that's part of why we're doing this podcast, right?
yes,
That's part of my reasons to do this podcast is because we need more representation for,
everything.
like people from all different backgrounds doing everything, right? And so, yeah, I'm just thinking about little Tonisha getting discouraged about being elected to be a judge, and it's like, oh, I don't think, yeah, we still have a lot further to go in representation, and I think, but at the same time, I think we've made some progress, right? Now,
Yes.
Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is on the Supreme Court, and how amazing would it have been if you were in elementary school right
And
now and to be able to see that in the highest court in the United States, right? But we didn't grow up in this. I mean, we were growing up in a different time. So,
yes.
yeah. And then the military, that thing was always there.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting because I think in high school, having already had that kind of like a set plan, you see a lot of kids kind of like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, and there's a mad craze.
Mm-hmm.
And I always was just like, oh, I'm doing this thing. And people are like, oh, and they're like, oh, you're really doing it. I'm like, yeah, because I'd been saying it for years. And so I
Mm-hmm.
even think some of the people I knew since like junior high, it's like when we graduated, they were just like, oh, okay. And then I left and they're like, oh, you actually went and did. I'm like, yeah, you. I'm like,
Dudes, I've been telling you.
yeah, like, yeah, it's been the plan for years. So it's like, even during like SAT time, I wasn't like the frantic high schooler about SATs because I was like, oh, I have to take the ASVAP, right? Which is essentially kind of the same thing. It might be a little more in depth though,
For
too.
the military.
Yeah. And so I was like, oh, I'm taking the ASVAB. I'm not taking SATs. And people are like, you're not taking SATs. And I'm like, no, that would be like double the work for no reason. Right. And so even like,
So, for our international listeners, the SATs are some standardized tests that high school kids take to put on their application for college. And so, you said it's called the
ASVAP,
ASVAP.
ASVAP. Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
ASVAP is for getting into the military.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it tells, I don't know anything about the ASVAP.
Oh, so the reason I say it might be a little more in depth than the SATs, right? Because SATs there's a lot of focus on like math, your reading comprehension. I think those are the main things. So the ASVAP, it tests you in all areas. Like it kind of helps place you in your job as well. I
Hmm.
mean, I had questions about mechanic stuff. You have the math portion, which is a chunk. You have like language reading comprehension. You have different portions that are asking about that. Then you have science. You have all the subjects you would go over in school, plus is basically what I would say, to
Wow.
see where you excel in and where would be the best kind of place to place you according to like your scores on stuff.
And do you apply for a specific branch of the military, or you just take the ASVAP and they place you? Like, how does it work?
Most people have an idea which branch they want to go to, so they'll go talk to a recruiter, and then from there the recruiter will get them set up. Like I know when I talked to, I already knew I wanted to go to Air Force, and so I want to say senior year contacted the Air Force recruiter, and so then my mom we went down to her office and stuff, and I did like the pre ASVAP. They'll do like a little
Mm-hmm.
quick like maybe 25 questions. I think the whole ASVAP is like it's it's a lot of questions. I don't even remember. I remember being like, oh my God. Like when I actually got in there, I was like, oh my God, it's going to take forever. But they do like a little, maybe 20 or so questions. And it might be 15. But to kind of get a gist of like how well you'll do, I think it was 25. And that I like 100% scored. And so she was like, oh yeah, nice. If not, then they work on getting you like up to whatever standard. So they'll give you like books to study. So you'll go through like reading and studying and doing a bunch of like pre-tests and stuff to just make sure you pass it.
Get to where you want to go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll get to where you go, but you also can like not pass it as well because some people think like, oh, and
Oh,
you're like, no, you can also like fail. That's what I mean. I don't remember how many questions. I know it's a lot of
wow.
questions. Like you're in that test room for a while. Their main thing is like make sure you pass it make sure you pass the ASVAP, and then from there we'll kind of dictate. But it's funny because they have a joke about like the army, and no disrespect, but like they'll say that like they'll waiver anybody in, because I guess there's been cases where people didn't pass the ASVAP, but they just like wavered them in.
There are still ways to get in if you don't pass.
I'll say if you're dealing with the right branch and the right recruiter, I'll say that. Air Force is definitely not wavering you in. There's like a educational standard that I think they try to uphold.
I see. What ended up being your job in the Air Force?
I ended up being a cop, but that was by choice. I went in wanting to be a cop. And like everyone's like, "What? Why?" And I was like, "I think because growing up, like I was saying earlier, with my grandfather, like going on base with him, like the first thing you see when you come onto a base are the cops, right? They're checking to make sure like you're authorized to be on base, and when you see them, like they stand out from everyone else on base because their hats are different, right? They're wearing berets. Um, Generally, their uniform, if they're doing what they're supposed to do, as now I'm older and have been in, their uniform is more sleek and put together.
So they just really visually stand out. Yeah.
They do. No, they do. It's funny because sometimes, like, you can kind of tell who's a cop even when they're just kind of walking. Not because it's like they have like a thing about them, but there's a certain kind of confidence, I think. That
I'm going to bleep that out.
Right, oh. Okay. I apologize.
No, it's okay. Power of the bleep. You can cuss as much as you want, and I can bleep all of it out.
Oh. But I think there's just a different air about them on base. And so I think growing up as a kid I caught that. And so I was just like, "Oh wow, that's what I want to do," which obviously coming from the black culture in America is kind of a big contrast, right? Of what most people. So even now when I'm like, "Oh, I was a cop," people are like, "You were a cop?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Some people are just like, "Oh, you just don't seem like that would be your job." I guess my demeanor and stuff, and I'm like, oh, And then some people are just also too, because like I am black. So either way, it's not a concept I think they expected to hear from me.
How did you end up feeling about that job? And what was it like to be a Black woman cop in the Air Force?
I will say, when I first got in, I enjoyed it. I liked it. I like to learn. There's a lot of learning with that. As time went on, you get more into the job and do things. I don't think that I realized, one, military is a very male heavy dominated just career period, right? And then
Right.
going into the cop field is another very male dominated heavy career field. So I was under like a double umbrella, if that makes sense. So learning how to maneuver through that definitely sometimes can be a challenge, and was definitely a learning experience, and a big like, I mean, I already kind of got a gist of like, how the world kind of looks at me and treats me. But that there's definitely times where I was just like, what what is wrong with people? Like what? Like, okay. And you got to think, the military people come from everywhere, right? People will enter instantly from everywhere. So it's like you're stationed, or your people on what we call your flight, which is basically your group that you would be assigned to work with, right? Are from everywhere. So it's like you experience dealing with people from the South, dealing with people from Midwest, dealing with people from um, you know the West Coast, East Coast, like all in one, right? So it's it's not like a concept of like, okay, I live in the West Coast, and so I learn how to maneuver the people from this region. You're dealing with everyone, so it is a very interesting, sometimes trying, very trying situation. But also there's good and bad, right? I think I managed to pull out the good for situations, but being black female cop in the military was a challenge. I'll say it was a challenge.
Was it harder to have respect with your group of military cops than with the rest of the Air Force population that you were policing? Like, because you were their cop? Like, was there like this kind of in group, out group within the Air Force that, because I feel like if you're a cop, you have some power, right? Did you feel that around the other service members that were not cops?
Yes, there definitely is a huge difference of I guess your interaction, right, with the people you work with versus the rest of, like, we'll say the base populace. For one, like, your group that you work with, you also train with them. There's some barriers that do get broke down once you start having to do certain things, right? Because especially military, like, you're taught to, you have to rely on other people, right? So you have to hope that these people know their job and do their job and know their position, do their position correctly, because everyone has a position to play and they need to play it for everyone to succeed. And so as you work and train with the people, a lot of stuff, barriers and things will get broken down. You start to build a camaraderie with your, as I call them, comrades. There are times, but sometimes that takes time, and it takes certain put in certain positions, right? And people having to learn to trust you and overcome their whatever negative nuances they in their feelings. And then that at some point you do have where you're trusted and you build that camaraderie with your group, right? So then versus the rest of the base populace, people still look at you as like you're a cop. So on top of it, like, first they're like, here comes the cops, whatever. And then whatever their nuances are about, just by looking at you or your job. Each group, each, I'll say, career field that works together, you're kind of built to be connected to each other. There's kind of a like us against them with the rest of the base, and not that we get trained, the cops get trained that way, but the rest of the base just kind of have like a unison, like it's the cops kind of thing. I think until they get to know maybe like one or two particular people. And I'll say, like, when I first got in, when I came, like, went through basic, all this stuff, and then you get to your base, and you have to do these like intro to base classes when you're new, which I honestly kind of think that it is a good thing. Initially, you're like, oh my god, I go sit for 2 weeks and like whatever. One, they're like having different people come in, so the resources on base and different stuff like that, especially if you're new to the military, so it's like you don't really know what you have access to or where or why. But then also you're in that course with all other people that are new also, so people that are new to the military, and it's different career fields. So when you're there in that point, you're not the cop, you're not the civil engineering, you're not the linguist or whatever. You're all new going through these courses. So you kind of make friends, right? You make friends with different people. So then I know, after I got out of that course, there's a couple people, like, we all stayed friends, and like we'd meet up and still like have lunch. So it's like that kind of helped. One of the guys, he was civil engineering, and he just happened to be from Rancho Cordova, which it used to be a neighborhood and kind of in Sacramento, and then they became their own city. I remember I seen him one day. He's like, Rancho Cordova is his own city now, and I looked at him and I was like, okay. Like, but he was, and so he was like super excited, and I was like, oh, congratulations. Like, so but him being civil engineering, me being a cop, right? So it's like these two people are interacting with each other and getting to like actually know each other in a way that, had we just seen each other on base, right, people are like, it's the cops, or whatever. It kind of gave me an intro too, because then he has
A
friends,
shared newbie experience. Yeah.
yes, yeah, and then people tell their friends like, oh, this is my friend so and so, and this is whatever. It's weird because it's like the military, there's a lot of like double, I don't know what you want to call it, because then it's like the military versus the civilians, right? And then it's like, even amongst each other, like, you might have your little whatever, but then you do at some point stick together when it comes to other stuff. So it's a very interesting dynamic in the military, even amongst just all the branches. You'll hear the branches talk mess about each other, but then at the end of the day, it's like nobody else can talk about us. Like, so it's like Army, you'll talk mess about Air Force or everyone. whatever. But then if a civilian person says something, then no matter who it is, they're going to be like, hey, watch your mouth.
It's like a sibling.
Yeah, it is.
Give your siblings like some grief and like kind of tease them, whatever. But like if other people are going to tease your siblings, you're going to be like, no.
Yeah.
This is my brother. You're not going to make fun of him.
Right?
I get to make fun of my brother. You don't get to make fun of my brother. Yes.
Yes. Like you don't have the saddest. Yeah.
I see. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. It really is like that. I guess like I said, it's Air Force, and like everyone says the same thing, and I was like, oh, the chair force or whatever, right? And I'm like, ha, you're like, ha ha ha.
That's the joke, chair force?
Yeah, the chair force. It's always the same thing. And it's like, it's funny, you guys always have the same joke.
The joke is that pilots get to sit? That's the joke?
Yeah. Or, just like the whole, that or, like we don't do anything or whatever. But I'm like, it's funny because every branch says the same thing about us. But I'm like, the problem is that you guys don't know what we do. And that should say a lot. Like, we obviously understand the element of like confidentiality, right? And so, because most people are like, what do you guys do? And I'm like, we do the things that...
It's good that you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. But it's funny because I've worked with every branch, especially being deployed overseas in war and different things, and they'll all joke on us, but at the end of the day, I've heard all of them eventually like, yeah, I should have went Air Force, or if I could do it, I'd probably go Air Force, or they'd be like, Air Force is a smart choice. Like, so it's like, okay, cool. I would say other than us, the Marines are probably the only other ones that, that's a totally different type of like life dedication. I give them a lot of kudos. It's a different intensity. That's what I'll say. It's a different intensity. If the intensity is over that, then it's probably like a Navy SEAL or Air Force Special Forces or what was it, Army Green Berets and stuff like that.
Right, I was going to say Green Berets. These are the things that I've seen in the media. Like, Marines, Green Berets, Navy SEALs. Like, I think of them as very, very intense.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. In part 2, we hear about Tonisha's deployments to Iraq, her reflections and advice to young people considering military service, her future plans, and more. Hope you tune in. If you like this podcast, this is a small budding program, so remember to follow us and share with your networks to help us grow. We're also on Instagram @TheCultureful, where we look forward to your messages and ideas for future episodes. This episode was produced and edited by me, with assistant editing by Ruben Yana Ruben. I'm Jess Lynn. See you soon.